Please welcome Vice President of Partnerships at The Atlantic, Peter St. John.
Welcome to Redefining American Justice. My name is Peter St. John, and I'm Vice President of Partnerships here at The Atlantic. Roughly 1 in 3 adults in the United States have been arrested, convicted, or incarcerated. The criminal justice system's impact goes well beyond those individuals, their changing families, the victims, and society at large. In this forum, we are bringing The Atlantic's reporting to life, examining the intersection of lived experiences, public policy, and new ideas that challenge what justice could look like in America today. Our goal is to move beyond what's broken and to reimagine what's possible. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our underwriter, the MacArthur Foundation, for their continued support of The Atlantic's journalism. Please silence your cell phones. If you hear an idea that you'd like to share, please use the hashtag TAF25 on social media. Let's dive in.
Here to discuss the big story, Leave Room for Mercy. Please welcome Elizabeth Bruenig, staff writer at The Atlantic, Sarah Gregory, criminal justice reform advocate and social work professional, with Janisha Watts, senior editor at The Atlantic.
Elizabeth Bruenig did something most of us would never do. She witnessed executions to really understand the nuances of capital punishment. That reporting led to her incredible Atlantic cover story, Witness. Today she's here with Sarah Gregory, whose heartbreak brings into focus the real human cost. So Liz, why was it important for you to bring the stories of death row into our consciousness?
I thought about the death penalty for a long time, since I was younger. And, you know, it always struck me as interesting, basically for religious reasons. Jesus was executed. And that, you know, struck me as very interesting growing up. And it's hard not to see, you know, echoes of, you know, that same system through society right now.
What were you hoping to interrogate?
You know, the territory of forgiveness and mercy, the types of experiences that people who are facing execution have and go through, just on the human level, was very interesting for me and something I wanted to spend some time on.
Okay. And your reporting also required that you confront your own understanding. And can you share some misconceptions that you had or what you learned?
So, in 2016, a few years before I started this reporting, my sister-in-law was murdered. She was stabbed to death by an ex-boyfriend in the town where my husband and I grew up, in Arlington, Texas. And I assumed at that point, you know, the family would be very interested in the death penalty. I mean, this is Texas. My family, my mother and father were, you know, in their way offering condolences by saying, we hope the guy gets the death penalty. And, you know, come to find out, my husband and his father opposed it, and weren't interested in pursuing that at all. And I mean, that was stunning to me. And I would have assumed that anybody in that position would support the death penalty or whatever the maximum penalty is for someone who killed your child, killed your loved one. But the more I reported on this and the more I spent time with families of people who had lost loved ones to violence, the more I came to realize that's not necessarily the case, that we can't assume maximal penalties like the death penalty are going to be the ones that are the most healing or most constructive for victims' families.
Yeah, and Sarah, your grandmother Dottie, she was murdered by your aunt's boyfriend, Jimmy. So before we get into the story, I'd just like for you to tell us, like, what your grandmother meant to you.
There's the pictures. My grandmother was everything, not just to me, but to our entire family. We have a very large family. She was our rock. She was the keeper of all secrets. Everybody confided in her. She was a nurse, a pilot. She was just an absolutely amazing woman. And even as a teenager, I would choose to spend my time with her at our farm instead of with my friends. And I think that really says a lot about who she was and our relationship together.
Yeah. So the death penalty is meant to make victims' families like yours get closure for justice. But what was your experience?
Well, it started for about 20 years. I felt the same way. I was filled with rage. When she died in 2001, not just the murder itself, but the fact that we were so close to Jimmy. He dated my aunt for 7 years, all holidays, family vacations. We did all of that together. And so the thought of somebody who claims that they loved her inflicting such pain on her and on our family, it enraged me. And I did spend 20 years waiting for his execution, quite frankly. And throughout that time, I watched my family be destroyed. I watched my parents' marriage of 27 years fall apart. My aunt barely hung on. And we never had any holidays together as a family after that. None of them at the farm, which we would have every holiday with. So everything that I knew up until that point was destroyed. I fell into substance use for a long time. And in 2013, I found recovery. And throughout that time, I really tried to find myself again because I lost my voice. I lost every sense of who I was when I lost her. I really did. And so I spent a long time working very hard on finding me again. But there was this one piece that kept holding me back. No matter what I did, I stayed filled with rage towards that man. And for a long time, I couldn't even say his name. Finally, I kept asking over and over and over again. I was asking those that worked with me, how can I forgive him? How do I get to that point to where I can reach this forgiveness? Because it was leaving this dark spot in my soul. And I could not do it anymore. But no matter how much I tried, for the longest time, I could not find that forgiveness.
Yeah, what I found super fascinating was the fact when you finally decided to forgive him, and you decided to write, and you wrote the letter, and I think in turn it also like freed him. And if you can talk a little bit about that, of just like a process of just like coming to terms with just like forgiveness.
Just forgiveness and getting to the point to where I could even write the letter down. In 2020, on her birthday, I distinctly remember writing on Facebook to her, though, and I wrote that I could not take this pain anymore. I could not carry this burden, but I did not know how to release it. And I remember writing that she forgave everybody because she did. She taught us that forgiveness is one of the biggest things you have to do to anybody that hurts you. She forgave everybody. She believed in second chances, and she believed that there was good in every situation and every person. And for me to continue to hate, it took everything that she taught away from me. And I remember writing like, please, Lord, help me forgive the unforgivable and help me find a way to be able to forgive him. And 3 months later, I was in my car, and I'm a big Bruce Springsteen fan, and his song premiered, Letters to You. And as soon as that song started playing, I instantly started crying. And the song talks about writing to the person or situation that hurts you the most. And you put down the pain that it caused you, but any good things that have come of your life at the same time. You lay it all out there. And I knew that was exactly, it was like my answer, right? Like, I'm gonna have to hit you over the head because you're a little hard-headed. This is what you have to do. And I did that. That night, I wrote everything down, and I actually allowed myself to not hold back and to mail it to him.
I mean, we can clap to that if you want, guys. That was, But so Liz, the other thing I wanted to know is just like how common is it for people for experiences like Sarah's? Like how do you found that in your reporting? If you can talk about that.
Yes. So as I was saying, I would have thought it would have been very uncommon, but actually in several cases I have worked on death penalty cases, the families of the victims have opposed capital punishment. So one man who was executed in Alabama in 2022, I believe, Joe Nathan James, Alabama botched his execution, tried to cover it up. And, you know, while I was reporting on that story, I came into contact with his victim's family. He had murdered a woman named Faith Hall. She was his ex-girlfriend. Her brother, Faith's brother, and her 2 children opposed the execution and were quite emphatic about that in public. They didn't want this to happen. They wanted the opportunity to speak with him for reasons, you know, that Sarah is expressing, that they had a lot of emotions they wanted to discharge in a certain way. And, you know, one thing that's interesting about capital punishment is if the victim's family is in favor of capital punishment, then prosecutors are all in. They bring them out before the cameras and they have them talk to the press and so on and so forth. If a victim's family is against the execution, it's crickets from the prosecution. So the prosecution never responded to Faith Hall's family's desire to halt the execution or even to meet Joe Nathan James. In the case of Jimmy Barber, Sarah was willing to be forgiving in a really incredible way. In the case of, so this happens as well. Oftentimes the victim's family and the perpetrator's family, same family. And there have been a lot of cases where people who are part of the victim's family but also related to the offender, I think, have had very mixed feelings about executions. And I suppose that's the case in the case of Alfred Bourgeois, who I saw executed in Terre Haute in 2019 or 20. Yeah.
So explain who America sentences to death and what nuance the tough on crime political rhetoric doesn't account for.
Well, you know, I think tough on crime rhetoric doesn't take into account the fact that people who commit crimes are not necessarily the most evil people in society, and that committing a crime, even a very heinous crime like murder, is often the result of a number of different factors in a person's life that sort of brought them to that moment. And it's not right to say they didn't have any choice. They have a choice, and they are people should be held accountable for their choices. But in many cases with murder, with homicide, you see people who's either have a significant history of trauma and abuse, substance abuse disorder, mental illness, or intellectual disability. And I would say those are the 4 big categories that most homicides, perpetrators of homicides fall into. I worry about the tough on crime rhetoric and the sort of moment we're having right now, with a lot of fear over, what is described as rising crime, even though crime is low relative to the past. And the last time we had a big surge in executions, it was the 90s, and that was as a result of sort of widespread panic about crime, what they call the crime wave. And I think we're about to enter some years that might look a bit like that as well.
Yeah, and can the need for public safety, the pursuit of justice and humanity coexist?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think as good evidence, lots of other countries have criminal justice systems or criminal legal systems that don't have nearly the struggles that we have with our criminal justice system in the United States in terms of rehabilitation and so on and so forth, just humane treatment of people who've committed crimes and, a look at reducing recidivism. And so that is possible. The United States is a very violent country. It's more violent than a lot of countries of comparable development. And so that's a challenge for us. But I sort of have a feeling that reforming the criminal justice system would reduce that violence.
Yeah. And I really want to get this question right, so this is to both. But both of you have come face to face with people society has deemed irredeemable. Sorry, my tongue tied. Sarah, through your friendship with Jimmy, and Liz, through your reporting on death row, how do we reconcile the very harm these individuals have caused with their fundamental humanity?
So, For Jimmy and I, once I wrote him and he ended up writing back, and in the long run, I gave him my number and he started to call me, and we did form a friendship, a very deep friendship from that, something that I never saw coming. This man that I couldn't even say his name, all of a sudden when something happens in my life, aside from running to my husband, of course, I was waiting for him to call so I could share it with him. He helped me in many areas of my life. They're very resourceful in prison, and he found resources that I couldn't even find to help me in certain situations. So,
what's some of the examples?
My son has significant mental health, and he was in need of a residential treatment center, and the men inside death row at Holman were able to come up with some resources and contact numbers that we were able to use, and actually did get him into a wonderful residential treatment center. Wow. And he's thriving now. Oh yeah, wow. Because of them.
Is there, so Liz, the thing I wanted to, is there such thing as being beyond redemption? And I know in the story, I forget the man's name that was on death row, but he killed his wife, and he molested his daughter, and then I think he ended up writing a letter and saying that he would do it again, even if he had the opportunity. And I just want to know, I want to hear your thoughts on that. That was just mind blowing.
Yeah, I mean, those, working on the death penalty, there are certain cases that are easier than others. In a homicide case where, someone was shot and killed in an illegal transaction of some sort, where it was about money or drugs, it's not so viciously personal as someone molesting his daughter, killing his wife, and then saying he would do it all over again. And so I thought, David Neal Cox was a very difficult person to develop any kind of sympathy for. But, the more I looked into his case, he did write letters saying that he would kill his wife again. But he also wrote letters about how his mind was controlled by this different skin he lived in. He was like, I live in two skins. One of them is evil and cannot be saved, and the other one is good and wants to live. And I think in his effort to be executed, he was a death row volunteer, he wanted to die. In an effort to get himself executed, he wrote those letters about he would do it again, and so forth. And I think in his case, it just became very hard to disentangle what he'd done from the fact that he was on meth and also was severely mentally ill. And so, you come to realize, I think, this person, may not be a very good person, but may not be so evil as that there's nothing that can be done with them to rehabilitate them. I believe that with the right treatment, David Neal Cox could have lived in prison a life that was safe for him and other people.
Yeah. And Sarah, your decision to forgive Jimmy didn't just affect you. It reunited his family and transformed multiple relationships. What are the broader social implications when we choose mercy over retribution, and how might these reshape entire communities?
When we can sit down and have a conversation and open up the door for mercy and redemption, we can transform the criminal justice system. When we send inmates to prison, we're constantly. I'm sorry, I went blank. Okay, when we send inmates to prison, we are not rehabilitating them. Yeah. Okay, so we're not working with them. We're not holding accountable for their actions, but leaving space for dignity and grace at the same time. And until you do that, then you're just going to keep perpetuating the same cycles over and over and over again. So there has to be an open communication so that they can be redeemed and rehabilitated. So then if they are released, or when they are released, that they're not committing crimes over again.
Yeah, and the other thing too, Liz, like I was telling you earlier, I'm just in awe of your reporting and how you don't look away. The title is a perfect title, Witness. And I think I just want to hear, as a journalist, why do you think it's so important to have to tell these type of stories and to add like humanity to like, you know, people who other people would kind of like just write off.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, my background is in religious studies. I studied Christianity when I was in graduate school. And I've always been interested in mercy and forgiveness because they're the really hard, unfun, alien parts of Christianity. It just doesn't come naturally to you to say, someone has hurt me, so I'm going to give them the opportunity to do it again, turn the other cheek. Those seem to me like the most challenging commandments in the Bible. And I think they're interesting because they're hard. And so I want to present these cases because they're hard, because they're difficult, and because even in those cases there are glimmers of light, of humanity, of redemption, which I think bring forth the beauty in ideas like forgiveness and mercy, even though it's a harsh beauty.
Yeah, and the thing too, Sarah, so in going back to your, you forgiving Jimmy for your grandmother's death, like how, if you can kind of talk about like, did you, once you wrote that letter, and like, how did you know he was like, it was forgiven? Because I know some people probably just like, how is that like just possible? Like, was it a feeling? Like, was it just, like, how did you like come to terms with that in like your mind when you were just like, you know what, I can't hold on to it?
It was definitely a process. It wasn't instantaneous. I didn't write that letter and then immediately send it off. I'm like, oh, that was amazing. This is great. I felt better because I was able to get everything out, and I felt better when I was able to officially mail it off, and I didn't stop myself. I started to see that something was changing just in the fact that I did not prevent myself from sending that to him. But it definitely wasn't completely lifted at all. Approximately a month later, I got a letter back from him, and I let that letter sit on my counter for about a week because it still took my breath away when I looked down and saw his name and his writing, right? So there was still a lot of pain, a lot of shock that I even had allowed things to get to that point in the first place. And after about a week, I did read his letter, and I absolutely broke down when I did. And I broke down because he had been this monster under my bed for so long, 20 years. He was the person that inflicted the most pain on myself and my entire family. And I had so much rage towards him. But when I read that letter, he owned up to everything that he did. He not only asked for the forgiveness, but he also told me everything that he had done in prison in the past 20 years to try to make up for the act that he did. And I realized that there was more to him than just that one act that destroyed his life as well and destroyed his family's life. I was able to see in reading that he had dignity and worth, and that he was worth redemption. And through the crying and through the reading at that very moment, that is when it literally lifted. Like they say, the weight comes off. It did. The weight came out of my heart. I felt it. And I knew something was totally different at that point in time. I had no idea it would progress to what everything progressed to, but I knew I had no more hate in my heart for him. That blackness that I had inside that I wanted to get rid of for so long, that is the moment that I felt it leave.
And Liz, like how much do you think that, like when we're thinking about giving people death penalty, like how much should we factor in the families, like if the families are not for it? Because I know in your case, like you didn't want Jimmy to die, like you didn't want it to happen to him. But how much do you think we should factor that in?
So I think our criminal justice system is not set up for victims at this point. It is a punitive, non-rehabilitative criminal justice system. I think that we do need to create more resources for victims and their families that could issue from the criminal justice system. as to how to factor in the opinions of family members, I think there are just some penalties that you have to take off the table. But I think it's completely appropriate for family members to read victim impact statements in court and to represent their views and opinions to the people who are deciding what the fate of these individuals will be. But I think you've got to create limitations around that.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of limitations?
Well, you should be able to express your desire to the prosecutor, and you should be able to present your story in court. But I don't think you should be able to pursue the death penalty, even if that's what the family desires. I think you have to draw a line around the sacredness of human life.
And then, Sarah, as far as your family, I know some was probably for the death penalty. How did your forgiveness also impact them?
They definitely, there is a lot of them that were still in favor of that. But I have such an amazing family that we have respect for each other's opinions, no matter what they are. And we're able to acknowledge that our pain is the same. We all lost her. A mother, a grandmother, a friend. It didn't matter. We all felt the pain from losing her. So we were able to, throughout the trial and throughout the execution, to sit there and love and support each other and respect our differences. My mother did forgive him. She honestly started her path of forgiveness because she wanted to be able to understand how I could forgive him, because she was afraid that some family members would be very upset when the execution came, and she wanted to be able to stand up and defend me. And that's how her path started. And she asked me to have Jimmy call her, and so I did. And it took one phone call, and she was talking to him multiple times a week up until the execution as well. So,
well, thank you. We cut for time, but thank you so much for this interview, and just please give a round of applause for Liz and Sarah.
For a session produced by our underwriter, the MacArthur Foundation, about transparency, please welcome Bria L. Gillum, Senior Program Officer of Criminal Justice at the MacArthur Foundation.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. A huge thank you to The Atlantic for giving the MacArthur Foundation the platform to talk about criminal justice. It's a pivotal time for those of us who believe that the justice system needs to change, that we are incarcerating too many people, and that we don't believe in the idea of humanity and rehabilitation. But we know that in this country, more than 11 million people are admitted into jail each year, and more than 60% of those people have not been convicted of a crime. Any time in jail is a huge societal cost for families and communities. They include lost income, damaged families, untreated mental and physical illness, wasted taxpayer dollars, more unemployment, more unhoused people, and oftentimes more crime. Under the Foundation's initiative, the Safety and Justice Challenge, we are investing in over 100 local communities to bring together people who are often isolated in the decisions that impact their personal and community safety. We believe that whether you're a prosecutor, public defender, judge, teacher, researcher, advocate, you name the role or responsibility, you play a role in what your safety looks like and feels like. We are investing in data-driven ideas and practices that prevent people from cycling in and out of the justice system. This includes policies and programs that keep people who may be experiencing an underlying or undiagnosed mental health issue, addiction to drugs or alcohol, or experiencing unstable housing, and providing them with the resources, help, and support they need to stay outside of the justice system. We are investing in rehabilitation services to ensure that individuals who may experience incarceration have the resources, supports, and a community to help them find stable employment, workforce and educational training, and successful reintegration with their families and communities. And we are investing in research and communication to show that you can safely reduce crime without compromising safety, and highlighting promising practices and models that can be adopted in other communities. But for the 11 million people who may experience jail anywhere from a few days to years, there is real harm and lasting scars to their incarceration. From inhumane treatment to long periods of isolation to deplorable conditions, all of which question whether we as a society believe in a second chance. Here to uncover some of those scars that we often try to hide behind the bars of our jails and prisons is Professor Andrea Armstrong, a MacArthur Genius Fellow and Professor of Law at Loyola University. Please join me in welcoming Professor Armstrong to the stage.
Good afternoon. I am so honored to be here with you because what I want us to do between these two amazing presentations is I want to ground the discussion in what it actually means to live behind bars. And that means that we are thinking about millions of people who are behind bars across 6,000 facilities across the country. That includes prisons, that includes jails, and that includes detention centers. So when ICE takes somebody into custody, when the police arrest someone, or when someone is convicted, they go to spaces like these. And in fact, they are disappeared from our view and from the public conscience. This is a cell that I discovered. I had been in the New Orleans jail a dozen times. And I was with a man named Kiana, and he said, this isn't where they held me. This doesn't look like what I was seeing when I was here. So we searched that building top to bottom, and we found this hidden wing on the second floor of those isolation cells. Of cells where you couldn't move, where you had no access to sunlight, and where it was impossible to call for help. And you might ask, how can such a cruel space exist? And what I want to help you understand today is that these are spaces of enormous and expansive government power. They tell you what to eat. They control whether you can see a doctor or not, what you breathe, what you drink, what you wear, when you sleep, when you shower, every element that affects your health and well-being. At the same time, individual rights are at their lowest. Right? These spaces are places where abuse and neglect can occur. And law does special work to maintain the separation between the power of the government and rights, but also to keep these spaces hidden from us, the public. This is another cell. This is an entire tier for mental health treatment in the New Orleans jail, and this is a restraint bed. The rules that apply to you and to me for our health care don't apply to people who are behind bars. Right? So the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid have rules about when you can use restraint beds. And when you're on one of those beds, you are restrained at your ankles, at your wrists, and sometimes across your belly. The rules that govern and limit its use are also not present behind bars, which means that it was on a bed just like that one that Cain Maselli died. So Cain Maselli had been strapped to a bed in the New Orleans jail for 4 hours, and she told the guards that she couldn't breathe. Turns out her asthma medication was actually downstairs in the property room in her purse. If she hadn't died 4 hours in, she would have remained strapped in 4-point restraints for an additional 5 hours, in violation of every rule that protects the health of you and me. And it's not just Cain. It is Jaquin, who is 15. It is Narada. It is Miss Cantrell. It is Tracy and William and Ryan. And all of them belonged to somebody. They were loved by somebody. They were football fans. They were poets. They were dancers. And it's not just their families that lose, it is us as a community. We lose. It raises the question of how much do we know about what happens in our jails and prisons. I live in New Orleans. I was born and raised there. They all died in the New Orleans jail, and the question I had was, who is keeping track of this? Right? Do you know how many people have died in your local jail or your local prison? And not just how many, but why? Because none of them were sentenced to death. I want to close by looking at one of my favorite pictures, because it tells me so many things. This is the underside of a bunk in the jail. And it is a calendar that was made with toothpaste. This picture is a stark reminder of how we deny the most basic things to people who are behind bars, regardless of the reason that they ended up there, immigration or pretrial or conviction, because we deny people the ability to tell the time. We deny people the ability to know which day it is. But this picture is also one of my favorites because it reminds us of the perseverance of the human spirit. That even in those conditions, someone said, I deserve to know what day it is. And their creative ingenuity created this calendar. It reminds us of their humanity. The dirty secret of prisons and jails and detention centers is everybody eats the same food, sleeps in the same bed, and sees the same healthcare professional. The punishment, even when it's not supposed to be punishment, is the same. This picture also helps me understand that these are our jails and prisons and detention centers. And because they belong to us, they are also our responsibility. Thank you so much.
Here to discuss What Justice Demands, a conversation with Bryan Stevenson, please welcome Founder and Executive Director of the Equal Justice Initiative, Bryan Stevenson, with Clint Smith, staff writer at The Atlantic.
Hello, hello. It is a pleasure to be here with you all, and it is a pleasure to be here with Bryan. Bryan is someone I've looked up to for so long. He inspired my graduate school dissertation, which examined how children sentenced to life without parole make meaning of the purpose of education while they're in prison. No one should ever read it. I'm not saying it was good, it just inspired it. And has done more, I think, perhaps than anyone to demonstrate for the country the moral incongruence of the way that our criminal justice system exists, and helped us to imagine the possibilities for what it should be. And if he couldn't get any cooler, he was played by Michael B. Jordan in a movie. And so that does help. We don't have that much time, but there's so many things I want to ask you. And I want to begin because last year on this stage, I interviewed Ketanji Brown Jackson and talked about her life, her work. This was the early days of her being on the Supreme Court. And you have argued in front of the Supreme Court on several occasions. I think being on the winning side and all but one, quite the winning record. But what is true is that we are operating with a fundamentally different Supreme Court today than the one you argued in front of. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you think the shift in the Supreme Court has impacted the moral and strategic nature of the work that you and EGI are doing, and how you are sort of positioning yourself given the specific sort of judicial context that we're working with.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. This is a very different moment than I've experienced actually during my lifetime. I'm a product of Brown versus Board of Education. I grew up in a community where black children could not attend the public schools, and black people were only 20% of the county. So if you had a vote on whether black kids could attend the public schools, we would have lost the vote. The people who raised me and the adults in my community didn't have high school degrees because there were literally no high schools for black people in our county. But lawyers came into that community to enforce the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown versus Board of Education. And because there was a commitment to the rule of law, those school doors opened for me. I got to go to high school. I got to go to college. That's how I became a lawyer, because lawyers use the rule of law to create rights for me in a community that was marginalized, that was disfavored. When I came out of law school, I knew that the law and using the law was going to be the most effective tool for this growing population of people who were filling up our jails and prisons. As most people know, we went from less than 300,000 people in our jails and prisons in the 1970s to over 2 million people by the end of the 20th century. And when the Bureau of Justice projected that 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country in 2001 is expected to go to jail or prison, I saw that as a calamity, a crisis. It was not unlike the pandemic, except there was no pandemic-like reaction. And so the courts became the primary place where we might be able to protect people with disabilities, children, people with mental illness, people with intellectual disabilities, and all kinds of other vulnerabilities that are being swallowed up by this commitment, this effort at over-incarceration. And that has largely been true. We've been able to do things in the courts that we couldn't do in state legislatures, like ban the death penalty for children, ban the death penalty for people with intellectual disabilities, to create rights for people who are disabled and dealing with things, to create conditions, rights around conditions of confinement. And so that has been the arc. But you're absolutely right. Things have changed. I think it actually started changing really about 12 or 13 years ago, where even the courts seem to be exhibiting some fatigue in enforcing the rule of law in some of these cases. I saw it in race cases where we were constantly arguing that racial bias had undermined the reliability of a conviction or a death sentence, and we were losing cases that we won a decade earlier. So for me, the shift had to require us to get outside the courts. And so while we're still using the courts to protect people who are vulnerable and disfavored, and we still want to see rights expand, I'm not as optimistic about this court expanding rights for the poor, the marginalized, and the disfavored. And that means we have to get outside the courts and create a kind of a different narrative about who we are as a society, so that more people in our country recognize the problem of putting everybody in jail or prison, punishing people in ways that are cruel and objectionable, doing horrific things to one another. And that's the kind of narrative work that we've been engaged in over the last 10 or 12 years. And it is in part a response to the limitations of this current moment and what we're seeing in our courts.
And so you've built this remarkable museum in Montgomery that keeps growing and growing, and we talked about backstage how it's not, the museum itself has contributed to a sort of revival of Montgomery and hundreds of jobs, and there are over 600,000 visitors who come to the museum and the memorial every year. It is, people are coming to Montgomery. A half dozen hotels have been built since the museum opened. How did you decide that the narrative work happens in a lot of different ways? Mm-hmm. How did you decide that a museum and a memorial, that version of memory making, of creating the infrastructure through which narrative, a new or a different or more honest narrative might take hold? How did you think about that, the lynching piece, and in establishing the sort of intergenerational connection between lynching, Jim Crow, slavery, lynching, Jim Crow, Reconstruction, and the like?
I mean, it all flowed from the same frustration about people not seeing what I see, knowing what I know. I was going into jails and prisons and seeing young children being tried as adults, placed in adult jails and facilities, and being just terrorized and abused. And, if you're in a visitation room and you go meet a young kid who comes in and within a matter of minutes is sobbing in your arms because he's been assaulted every night by the adults in that facility, it not only breaks your heart, but it makes you question what is wrong with us. And when you leave that facility, the question I always ask is, who is responsible for that? And the answer is we are, because we've allowed narratives about children. We've called them super predators instead of children. We've allowed this false idea that some children aren't children to influence our society. And we've created this fiction that the way we show our commitment to children is by treating gifted kids and privileged kids really well, while we allow abused kids and neglected kids to suffer. That narrative was the genesis behind everything we started doing. I didn't want to write a book. I just wanted to do my work, but I felt like I had to get people to understand what I was seeing, and that then made us think about the fundamental challenge we have in this country, which is, of course, the burden that we have inherited as a result of racial injustice, that narrative of racial difference that is still polluting our nation, that's everywhere you go, from the Northwest to the South to New England to the Mid-Atlantic. We are all corrupted by this toxic environment that I think is a result of our long history of unaddressed racial injustice. We have never talked honestly about what happened to indigenous peoples when Europeans came to this continent and they were forced off land, and we did horrific things, and that population was shattered by war and violence and disease. And our Constitution said we're committed to equality, liberty, and justice for all, but we didn't apply those concepts to Native people. We instead created a narrative of racial difference. We said, oh no, those indigenous peoples, they're savages. They're not going to get the benefit. And that narrative for me was the great evil of slavery. It was the thing that endured after 246 years of bondage. And for me, it is the great evil. I think the false narrative we created to justify enslavement. Enslaved people were enslaved by other people, and those enslavers didn't want to think of themselves as immoral or indecent or unjust, so they created a false narrative where they said, oh, black people are different than white people. Black people are less human, less evolved, less capable. And that survived the Civil War. I often argue that the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war, and that narrative was so powerful that it undermined our commitment to the rule of law. It's the reason why the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal protection, was not enforced by the Supreme Court. The 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote, was not enforced by the Supreme Court. They sided with states' rights, and that led to a century of disenfranchisement and terror violence. And again, nothing that we've ever really talked about. We just never addressed the harm created by the lawlessness of mobs killing, lynching thousands of black people pulled out of their homes and tortured on courthouse lawns, and the trauma that created for the 6 million black people who fled the American South. And, our demographic geography, it's so interesting to see what's happening now in urban spaces that are being tacked because they have black mayors and black leadership. Well, that demographic reality was a consequence of a half century of terror, violence, and lawlessness, because the black people in Chicago and Cleveland, Detroit and Los Angeles, Oakland, and Roxbury and Harlem mostly went to these communities not as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities, but as refugees and exiles from terror violence in the American South. They left lands that they owned. And we have a wealth gap in this country because black grandparents couldn't leave land to their children and their grandchildren. And that disparity is part of what we are still reckoning with. And that narrative of racial difference persisted throughout the 20th century. We did have a heroic civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s where we tore down the legal architecture of Jim Crow, and the courts were allies in that, right, from Brown all the way to Loving versus Virginia. But that narrative still persisted. And that's why, as the civil rights movement retreated, we saw this new investment in mass incarceration, that big increase. The court was monitoring it a bit, and now it seems as if they've given up any oversight. And so for me, the narrative struggle is the primary struggle. And we've created these sites because I think we have to reckon with this history. The countries across the globe that have done the best work reckoning with their histories of injustice are the countries that have made tremendous progress. Mm-hmm. We see Germany as an ally, even though just 80 years ago they were the villain of the world and they were doing horrific things, but they have reckoned with the history of the Holocaust. And you can't go 200 meters in Berlin without seeing monuments and memorials, and the Holocaust Memorial sits in the center of that city. Every student in Germany is required to study the Holocaust and learn about the Holocaust. They don't have people in Germany saying, oh, we can't teach our children about the Holocaust. That might make somebody feel uncomfortable or ashamed. They're not banning books about the Holocaust. They're not censoring people who talk about the Holocaust. There are no Adolf Hitler statues in Berlin. There are no monuments to the Nazis. I come from Alabama, where the landscape is littered with iconography, celebrating the very perpetrators of these narratives of racial hierarchy. And now, our federal government wants to restore the names of the people who believe in racial inequality, who never believed in the humanity of black people, back on military bases. And so that narrative struggle is very much kind of primal to what I think we have to do if we're going to kind of continue moving to make our legal systems responsive to the needs of vulnerable people.
And what does that mean in the context of this political moment where the President of the United States, posts that a museum like the Smithsonian, clearly alluding to the broader Smithsonian institution, but also the Museum of African American History and Culture, and says that the Smithsonian spends too much time talking about how bad slavery was. Have you in your museum experienced any pushback, any pressure? We have all this conversation like, is the Smithsonian going to begin removing different items that some might find offensive or uncomfortable, or that don't align with a specific and kind of narrow conception of what he calls a patriotic education? We already see, the way that they have taken money away and grants away from museums across the country, the African American Museum in Boston, the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana, because they don't align with the sort of ideological agenda of the current administration. And so how have you all been thinking about, and have you all experienced pushback or pressure given the new sort of social and political context that we're operating in?
Yeah, well, I feel really proud. We did not take one penny of state or federal money in building our museums, not one penny. And I always feel some kind of way when I say that. The truth is, we were never offered one penny of state or federal money for our museums. But it now insulates us from having to do anything restrictive. If anything, I feel an obligation to do more, to say more. I think this effort to minimize our conversation about the harms of history is such a threat to this country. I really do believe that we are not going to have a healthy future if we do not acknowledge the illnesses that we carry, the infections that we carry. I talk about this a lot. When you go to the doctor, you don't want a doctor who has been banned from giving you bad news if you have a disease. Right. If you have high blood pressure or diabetes, you need to know that so you can treat it and get better. And I think what's especially provocative about this kind of talking too much about slavery being bad is we don't understand that the trafficking and kidnapping of 13 million people from the African continent was a crime. It was a crime. And so we're saying to these crime victims, stop talking about the victimization. We did horrific things to black people in this country for 246 years. And it is, in my judgment, wrong at a fundamental level. You can't say you want to be tough on crime, you care about justice for victims and all of these things, when you ignore the immense suffering and constant sorrow of 10 million black people who endured the hardship of slavery for 246 years, when we do not acknowledge their harm, when we do not talk about the consequences of that harm, we're not only being dishonest, I think we're being unjust. Right. And so for me, it is a justice issue to talk more about the legacy of slavery, about all of the trauma and terror that was created by mob violence and lynching, all of the humiliation that we experienced in this country during the Jim Crow era, the presumption of dangerousness and guilt that follows black and brown people. It is an injury. And I don't think this administration would say to the people in New York City who had lost loved ones on 9/11, oh, you need to stop complaining about what you lost on 9/11. Just don't talk about that. Let's talk about all the good things we're doing. I don't think this administration would say to the survivors of the Holocaust, stop talking about the Holocaust. Talk about all the great things that Jewish people have done in the last 80 years. Wouldn't say that because it is fundamentally unacceptable and offensive. And so to say to African Americans or Native Americans, stop talking about your harm, even when this country has never acknowledged that harm, to me is a huge threat to what kind of society we're going to become, because I don't think that censorship and banning and silencing is the way we're going to create a world where maybe the children of our children are no longer burdened by this history in the same way. I want my grandchildren and their children to not have to worry about presumptions of dangerousness and guilt when they go into a store or when they go into an airport or when they encounter a police officer. I don't want their parents to have to prepare them differently than their white friends to navigate conflict with an officer. But we won't get there if we don't have the courage to talk honestly about this history. And I just think that it is an essential, fundamental threshold question. I think it is a justice question that we have to reckon with. And for me, it is the priority in this moment.
You know, so much of your work is about this idea of proximity, both a sort of physical proximity to those who are living in poverty, to those who are justice impacted, to those who are who've been left behind, given the sort of intergenerational holes that exist in our social infrastructure, but also are, as you sort of so beautifully alluded to, our sort of temporal proximity to the past in that way. And I think all the time about how when I went to the National Museum of African American History and Culture with my grandparents, my grandmother was born in 1939, Jim Crow, Florida. My grandfather, born in 1930, Jim Crow, Mississippi. And we're visiting the museum, and it's the first time they're visiting the museum. And I'm pushing my grandfather in his wheelchair. His cane is laid across his lap. And my grandmother's walking a few paces ahead of us. And I have this moment where I realize that they are walking through exhibits that talk about things that they experience firsthand.
Yeah, that's right.
And I asked my grandmother later about it, and she had this refrain, and she said, I lived it. I lived it. I lived it. And I think about how the woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture in 2016 was a woman named Ruth Bonner. And she was the daughter of a man who was born into slavery. Right? Not the granddaughter, not the great-granddaughter. The woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture in 2016 was the daughter of a man who was born into slavery. My grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. So when my two little kids sit on my grandfather's lap, I imagine him sitting on his grandfather's lap. And I'm just reminded that this history we tell ourselves was a long time ago simply wasn't that long ago at all. You know, you said slavery existed for almost 250 years and has only not existed for 160. So you have an institution that existed for almost a century longer than it hasn't. An institution in which there are people who are alive today, who knew, who love, who were raised by, people who were born into chattel slavery. And so I think that people can forget what our collective temporal proximity is. And I bring that up because I think, you know, I've been thinking a lot about this question about like, well, what is there's such a urgency from the administration and those in a sort of similar ideological camp to get us to stop teaching slavery, to get us to stop, to take these things out of the museum, stop talking so much about it in the African American History Museum of all places. And I think it is not that they don't believe slavery happened, or even that slavery mattered or that it was consequential. I think they believe those things, and I think they believe that it was bad, most of them. But I think the bigger thing is that they recognize, as your museum and your work broadly recognizes, that once you begin to understand the history of what happened, once you begin to actually understand the economic, social, historical, political impact of what slavery was, of what Jim Crow was, of what lynching was, of what mass criminalization is, then you can no longer sort of look around this country and be like, oh, well, the reason one community looks one way and another community looks another way is simply because of the people in those communities, right? You're disabused of that notion. It forces you to then look around and say, oh, actually, the reason this community looks this way and this community looks this way is because of the things that have been done to those communities, or the things that have been extracted from those communities generation after generation after generation. So how are you thinking about the impact that that notion of proximity, both in a contemporary sense with the people who are experiencing the residue of this history, but also what it means to make people proximate? Like, what ways are you thinking about how to make people proximate physically, emotionally, psychologically to that history? Yeah.
Well, I think you're right that it's both kinds of proximity. I think it's so easy in this country to separate yourselves from the problems of the poor, the problems of the incarcerated and the condemned. We have the ability in too many places to just kind of insulate ourselves. And so I think it requires a commitment to get close to the poor, the marginalized. We believe in proximity when it comes to technology and science. Business people believe in it because you can't make good investments if you don't understand exactly what the model of success is, what's going to shape demand and supply. You study those things carefully, and that's how you become a good investor. We believe in this in the context of science. But somehow when it comes to justice, we believe we can be good at policymaking around justice and be far away from the people who are experiencing injustice. And I think that's a mistake. When you're proximate to the poor and the excluded and the neglected, you hear things you won't otherwise hear. You see things you won't otherwise see. And what you hear and see shapes and informs your worldview. That panel earlier, that beautiful woman got close to a condemned man and began to understand things that weren't possible without that nexus. And I think that opportunity exists for all of us, and that's why I keep emphasizing it, because I think it is key to how we become healthier, how we become more human, how we get past the polarization, how we get past this differencing that seems to be shaping everyone's discourse these days. But I also think that historical proximity is important too. My grandmother was raised by people who were born in slavery. My great-grandparents were enslaved, and my grandmother was strategic and tactical. She had 10 children. My mom was the youngest of her 10 kids. She had never lived through integration. Her life had been shaped by Jim Crow. And so when they integrated the schools in our community, after those lawyers came in, I think she got really worried about me. And she started doing this thing where she would come up to me. I was like 9 years old, and she would give me these hugs, and she would squeeze me so tightly, I thought she was trying to hurt me. And then she'd see me an hour later, and she'd say, Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you? And if I said no, she would jump on me again. So by the time I was 9 or 10, I'd learned every time I saw my grandmother, the first thing I would always say is, Mama, I always feel you hugging me. And she'd smile this smile. And I didn't appreciate all that she was teaching me. She worked as a domestic her whole life, cleaning other people's houses. She lived into her 90s, but she fell when she got in her 90s, and she broke her hip, and then she was diagnosed with cancer. I was in college at the time, and I went to go see her. And she was on her bed, her eyes were closed, and she wasn't responding to anything I said. But I just couldn't imagine being in the world without my grandmother, and I just started talking. I persuaded myself, she can't die while I'm talking. And I was in there talking forever, and finally somebody came in and said, you can't stand here and talk forever. And they made me say my goodbyes, and I tried to say my goodbyes, and I turned to leave, and that's when my grandmother squeezed my hand. She opened her eyes, and she looked at me, and she said, Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you? And then she said, I want you to know I'm always going to be hugging you. And the power of this history is that, the African American experience isn't just trauma and violence and enslavement and suffering. There's also this other side of strength and courage and resilience, despite the brutality of slavery, despite the number of women who were raped, despite the threat of ever-present threat that you would be sold away from your children. Enslaved mothers loved their children. Enslaved people learned how to love in the midst of agony. And that is also that legacy. And so I feel lifted up by all of those 10 million people. I feel like they're with me. And sometimes when I go to court, it's easy to feel like you're going to court by yourself. When you stand up and they tell you to sit down, when you speak and they tell you to be quiet, you're going to be all by yourself. But recently, particularly as I've been doing this narrative work, I don't feel like I'm ever alone. I feel like when I stand up, standing behind me are those 10 million enslaved people whose stories and lives have not been acknowledged, those millions of people who fled terrorism and violence, the tens of millions who had to deal with the humiliation of Jim Crow segregation, the millions of people we have incarcerated unfairly and excessively. I feel like they are with me, and I think they are with all of us if we find a way to get proximate. Proximity gives you something that allows you to move forward. It carries you, it pushes you. And yes, I do think that is the narrative for this moment. If we're going to confront some of the ignorance and the bigotry and the violence and the abuse of power that I think we're witnessing, we're going to have to get closer to those who are experiencing inequality and injustice, who suffer, who are falling down, and understand the power we get collectively when we build community with those communities.
I think that's quite the note to end on. Everybody, please give it up for Bryan Stevenson.